Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your personal Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description. This will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship right here at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We're in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we get into our study today, we are returning back to the book of Genesis. And in Genesis, we are in session 6, which is titled Blessed, looking at Genesis chapter 30, specifically verses 25 through 34, and then 41 through 43. So again, this is session 6, titled Blessed, and we're going to be looking at Genesis 30, verses 25 through 34, as well as verses 41 through 43. You know, a lot of the times when we think of the word blessed, we might think of the words, the words that we kind of use it most often. And when I kind of think of the word blessed or the word bless or blessings or whatever it is, usually that kind of ends up falling into two categories. We often think about when people sneeze and we say, bless you. You know, Kentucky is located in the South. We might also hear it said as kind of a bless your heart type of statement. Or we might also think about something like when we say the blessing for a meal and we pray over a meal. This is a kind of a churchy word that we have become very familiar with, but it's a excuse me, it is a churchy word that really has a lot of meaning and really has a significant amount of meaning, especially in the book of Genesis. The book puts it this way. It says, "What do you mean when you say God bless you?" The idea of blessing is a major theme in the book of Genesis. It means to bestow favor or to fill with benefits. Often blessings were just bestowed upon people not only to be a blessing to them, but for God to use them to be a blessing for others. It is important to remember that God is faithful to bless his people, and that one of the reasons he does so is that they might also be a blessing to others. This leads the book to ask a question, which was, how has God been faithful to bless you, and how do you think he wants you to bless others or he wants to bless others through you? So here's what we want you to do. We want you to take some time and interact with our videos. And so what we want you to do is when we ask certain questions, we're going to tell you to pause the video. And if you're watching this by yourself, we would love for you to get a pen and paper, write down, maybe get a notebook as you continue to watch more videos. You can kind of add to it. And just take time to interact with the questions that we ask. If you're watching this with your spouse or family or friends, then also pause the video, have some discussion time, and then just whenever you're ready, hit play again. So again, let me ask that question, and then we'll have you pause the video. It says, how has God been faithful to bless you? And how do you think he wants to bless others through you? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, have that discussion, write some things down, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right. Hopefully he has blessed you. Hopefully there's times in your life where you recognize and see God's blessing in your life. And with that, I want you to think about the ways that God has blessed you. Maybe it's with skills or interests or time or resources or who knows what it is. And how might you take those blessings and use those to be a blessing to others? If God has blessed you financially, how do you maybe give and give either to the local church or other charitable organizations or just to help other people out? If God has blessed you with certain skills, if you have always been very good at working with cars or working in home maintenance, or you've been a particularly good cook, or maybe you're good at numbers or whatever it might be. How do you use that to bless other people? Do you help people with minor car repairs? Do you donate your time to just minister to other people? Do you meet needs in the community? There's lots of ways that God does this, and he blesses us and then uses us to be a blessing to others. In today's session, we discover how God was faithful to keep the promises he made to Jacob at Bethel. So, after shepherding, Jacob shepherds Laban's flock for many years. He finally comes to the point where he is ready to move on, or specifically, he's ready to go home. Now, to just kind of give us a little bit of a pickup where we get to here, Jacob has gone back to his mother's, kind of homeland, and is connected with his mother's brother. And in this time, he meets his uncle's daughter, whose name is Rachel, and he falls in love with her. This was normal at this time, as this might be something we would frown upon now, but culturally speaking, not so much back then. And wants to marry her, and this is Rachel. And he works for Laban for 7 years, and then has a wedding, thinking that he's marrying Rachel, only to discover that Laban has pulled a fast one on him and has married him to Leah, his older daughter. Jacob marries Leah, that's a reality, but he still wants to marry Rachel, and ends up working 7 more years for Laban in order to marry the sister, marry Rachel. And so now he has 2 wives. We actually read in the chapter just prior to this how he comes about and has children. In fact, he has 12 children, which represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And now he's come to a place where he's ready to go home. He's ready to leave Laban and go home. And we're going to see the interaction between those two. And we're going to actually see how God has been working in Jacob's life, and how really that becomes apparent in this passage. So let's look at our passage today. We're going to start off in Genesis chapter 30, and we're going to read verses 25 through 30. And I want you to listen for Jacob's request to Laban and Laban's response. So picking up in chapter 30, verse 25, we read these words. It says, "After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me on my way so that I can return to my household. Give me my wives and my children that I have worked for, and let me go. You know how hard I have worked for you.' But Laban said to him, 'If I have found favor with you, stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you.' Then Laban said, 'Name your wages, and I will pay them.' So Jacob said to him, 'You know how I have served you, and how your herds have fared with me. For you had very little before I came, but now your wealth has increased. The Lord has blessed you because of me, and now when will I also do something for my own family?'" So let's think about this for just a second. So Laban has come to that place. He's had children. He has worked for Laban, all of these things. And now he kind of goes to Laban and says, "Let me go." And it's interesting to note here, he says, "I've done everything. Let me take my wives and my children and let me go home. I've worked for them. They are mine, and I want to go home." And what's interesting about this is he doesn't really ask for any material things. He has worked for his wives. He has worked for those things, and now he's ready to just go home. But what's really interesting here is Laban's response. See, Laban has learned something, or thinks he has learned something, and he has fared very well. As Jacob points out, he had very little, and now his wealth has increased probably significantly. And Laban apparently has gone to some sort of psychic or witch or something like that, and has, asked questions, and it has come about that this diviner, whoever this person is, this wizard or whatnot, has kind of done the superstitions and done whatever really probably demonic things that he or she has done, and has kind of come back to Laban and said, "The reason you're doing well, in fact, maybe even the only reason you're doing well, is because of Jacob, and that Jacob has God with him, and that God has favored him, and so the blessings that you are experiencing are actually the blessings of Jacob, and that's why you're doing so well." Now, it's interesting. What's going on here is wicked. This is witchcraft. This is something that is, against God, something that God calls the nation of Israel to eradicate, and is always viewed negatively within the pages of Scripture. And that's who Laban is. He is pursuing, probably some sort of pagan god, and using divination and those type of things. But God kind of lets him in on what's going on here, or maybe some demonic forces, letting him in and say, "Listen, Jacob is the reason you're doing well." And so when this happens, he tells Jacob, "What will it take to get you to stay? You've worked hard for me. I want you to stay. Name you. I know that I do better because you're here. What will it cost me in order for you to stay?" And that's kind of the interaction that's going here. And what Jacob kind of responds with is he says, "Listen, I've brought increase to you. All of this is your blessing. if I do anything, he's humoring, he's entertaining the idea. If I work for you, I need to do something for my family. I need to gain wealth from my family. And so he's kind of getting that idea of, it is time for me to start building up my family and not your family, because that's what he's been really doing up to this point. And now he's saying it's, I need to start to amass some wealth. And so what that probably tells us is he's not looking for simple pleasures or simple things, but he's wanting to start to amass a holding. And we're going to actually see that play out, because it's going to essentially kind of translate to his own sheep, his own goats, his own livestock, so that he can start to build up his own wealth. The book asks this question. It says, how would you describe the relationship between Jacob and Laban, and why? So maybe, feel free to read some context, but even just in the interaction we have, how does Jacob view Laban? How does Laban view Jacob in light of what we've read? And why do you think that is? Why don't you take a couple minutes, discuss that, pause the video, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so this is kind of an interesting interaction between these two, because you really get the feeling, first off, that Jacob's ready to be done with this guy. He's like, I've done all of this. You have got all the benefit. Now, obviously, he's got his wives and he's got what he wants. He's like, I've got my wives. I've got my family. It's time for us to part way. He's kind of done with Laban. Laban really views Jacob as kind of that golden goose. Like, I am doing well. I am succeeding because you're here, and so I want to keep you here. That is an interesting perspective, given that Laban is his son-in-law. One could argue his nephew. He's talking about taking away Laban's daughters and grandchildren, and yet all he seems to be concerned about is the wealth that he gets because of Jacob's presence. The book kind of says it this way. As Laban's son-in-law, you might have expected a warmer family relationship, but the implication is that Laban considered Jacob as more of a servant than a son-in-law. And I think that's an important thing to note here, is what we've seen consistently is Laban has kind of taken advantage of him. He's manipulated the situation. He has not been very honest. To be completely, forthright, this is kind of what we've seen happen already, is really kind of Laban's way of taking advantage of Jacob. And this may be the Lord's way of disciplining Jacob from being the liar and the trickster that we were first introduced to being more in line with who God intends him to be. And so there's not a good relationship here. In fact, I don't even think there's really that great of a relationship between Laban and his daughters in the grand scheme of all this. He's just not a good guy. And he uses people, and he views them more as a means to an end than the family and someone, like in God's image, that should be treated with dignity and respect. The book follows up with this question. It says, how did Laban's flock change while Jacob was watching them? And how does God's past blessings raise a person's expectation of the future? And so what we see from the passage, just answering the first question, is that Laban's flocks have increased. That when, kind of, for lack of better words, when Jacob showed up, Laban didn't have that much. He had next to nothing. In fact, he says, if you do, you know how I've served you and how your herds have fared with me, for you had very little before I came, but now your wealth has increased. And so there's a hope here, really. I think more than anything, there's a hope here, certainly from Laban's part, that he's wanting to take advantage of this, recognizing the past wealth and how they've done historically. And for a lack of better words, Jacob's just like, hey, it's time to start taking care of my own stuff. So let's look at the solution and what kind of ultimately transpires here, and look at verses 31 through 34. And I want you to kind of identify Jacob's response to Laban's question about wages. So he's going to kind of give that answer. He's like, okay, if you want me to stay, this is what you're going to have to do. And we're going to begin to see how through this, Jacob is starting to demonstrate more trust in the Lord and less trust in his own trickery or his own conniving. Let's pick up in verse 31. Laban asked, what should I give you? And Jacob said, you don't need to give me anything. If you do this thing for me, I will continue to shepherd and keep your flock. Let me go through all the sheep today and remove every sheep that is speckled or spotted. every dark-colored sheep among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the female goats. Such will be my wages. In the future, when you come to check my wages, my honesty will testify for me. If I have any female goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any lambs that are not black, then they will be considered stolen. Good, said Laban, let it be as you have said. Now, this is an interesting reality here. So, what he said is basically, I don't want like a continued wage. You don't have to continue to pay me like some long term thing. He goes, here's what I want you to do. Let me go through the flock, and any goat or any lamb that is speckled or spotted, every lamb that is brown or black, even. All of those let me take, and then you can keep everything else. And if you go through it when it's all said and done, and you find any that are speckled, spotted, or any that are not, speckled or spotted among mine, you can consider them stolen. You can take them back, almost like, and the deal will be off. And Laban says, okay. Now, this would have represented a significantly smaller portion of the flock than the ones that were all white. These are the ones that are going to be different, like unexpectedly different, with the spots and the speckles, the dark sheep, as opposed to kind of the white lamb that was more traditional. And so he's literally asking for a very small portion of the flock, but he says, but let those be mine. Let those be mine. Let me take those. And then all of the rest of it is yours. And as long as you just let this little portion be mine, I will work for you, and you can, and I'll take care of everybody, and everything will be good. Laban had recognized God's hand on Jacob and was trying to convince him to stay. And then so through this request, which seems unusual, Jacob had got what he wanted because he had the leverage. Because Laban really wanted him to stay, yet on the surface, his request seemed to favor Laban. So this was a great deal for Laban. He's saying, okay, so I get this guy, and in theory, I'm going to get the blessing that comes from him because he's going to be shepherding my flock, and all I have to give him is this really small portion of my flock, and that's it, one-time deal, and it's done, and I get all the blessing and all the favor. But then it begs this question: how did Jacob's request and his actions demonstrate a trust in God as opposed to a trust in something else? Why don't you take a couple minutes, pause the video, and think about that, and read the passage again. How does Jacob's actions and his request in this passage demonstrate that he is starting to really trust God and demonstrate his trust in God? Take a couple minutes, write some things down, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so what we're starting to see here is Jacob is starting to shift towards a deeper trust in God and away from his own deceitfulness or his own craftiness. We see he's very upfront with this. He's like, this is what I want. He says, in fact, if this is what I want, and you're free to really look through it and see if I'm trying to pull one over on you, and if I am, then you can accuse me of being a thief. And so we see his actions are very straightforward. This is what I want, and if I even try to pull one over on you, you can call me out on it. So we see some integrity, and what he's essentially saying here is God. He's believing that God can do more with this small amount of lambs and goats that you give me than what he probably can do with all of the lambs and all of the goats, all the sheep, all the goats that you currently have. He trusted that because God's blessing and God's favor was on him, because he had this promise straight from God at Bethel, that just even that little amount would do amazing and wonderful things in his hands. We really do start to see that the guy who was leveraging and using the soup to get a birthright, and then dressing up and getting help from his mom to get a blessing. Now he's suddenly saying, listen, just give me a little bit, and I know God can do more with a little than you can do with everything. And so just give me a little, and I'll trust God to bless me and to increase these things and to be with me through all of this. Kind of applying that to our own life, the book asks this question: what are some ways people demonstrate this kind of integrity today, and why is it important? And you're welcome to pause the video and think about that a little bit. Why is this a way, or excuse me, what is some ways that people demonstrate integrity today, or why is it important? But I'm going to go ahead and just answer that question. And just when you think about people in your life that demonstrate integrity, it's important because it leads to a trusting relationship. There are gentlemen and ladies too, for that matter, in our church that demonstrate a tremendous amount of integrity, integrity that they're going to do what they say they're going to do, integrity of being faithful to the scriptures. And there's both men and women in this church who, if they come to me and say, "Hey, I want to do this," because of their integrity, because of who they are and the integrity that they've demonstrated, I trust them, and I go, "Okay, great." Go for it. If you need my help, let me know. And I trust them. And there's a lot of other people that maybe I don't. I'm like, well, we need to talk about that. We need to get you help. Let's do that. It's because they haven't demonstrated the same integrity. One part that came to my mind immediately when this is, I've got a mechanic that I trust a great deal. I don't know that much about cars. I have a very, very general working knowledge of cars, but the ins and outs I don't know, nor do I have the tools for it. But I have been very blessed to have a mechanic that I trust. And he has demonstrated his integrity both in his job and in his faithfulness to the Lord on multiple occasions. And so if I take my car to my mechanic and he says, "Hey, this is what it needs. It's, that's not cheap," or whatever, I trust him. I know that he is doing what needs to be done, that he is giving me a fair price, and that he's going to take care of it, and it's going to be fixed. And his integrity leads me to not have to question him or second guess or anything like that, because I know he's in his integrity, and therefore I trust him. I hope that my wife, as I feel this way towards my wife, and I hope my wife feels this way towards me, that because she trusts me and I have proven my integrity over the years, that when I, have to stay late at the office or go on a trip or whatever it is, that I know my wife will trust me because I have proven my integrity to be a faithful husband and just a man that's going to take care of her and take care of the family. Moving on, it says, after Laban agreed to Jacob's proposal, the lambs and the goats were separated, and Jacob continued as the shepherd. And God continued to bless Jacob even at Laban's expense. Let's look at the last part of our passage to see how all of this kind of shakes out. We're going to jump down to verses 41 through 43, and I want you to listen for the result of Jacob's work. So we're going all the way to the end of the chapter, and it says this: whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob placed branches in the trough in full view of the flocks, and they would breed in front of the branches. As for the weaklings of the flock, he did not put out the branches. So it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban and the stronger ones to Jacob. And the man became very rich, and he had flocks and female and male slaves and camels and donkeys. And so what's happened here, and I don't want to get too tied around the description of the branches. This was probably a custom that they did. Sometimes we have just kind of customs, even rituals when it comes to farming or different things, maybe even an old wives' tale, like, oh, if you put this in the water, if you put this in their food, that will help them, be stronger. And there might have been some truth to it. There may not have been. I tend to lean away from this being something more spiritual or superstitious, because I really feel like Jacob is demonstrating a tremendous amount of trust here. But what I do think we see here, as we read you read the context in between, Jacob took care of all of the flock. But because it was his flock, he made sure he did that extra work, that he did everything he could to see his flock thrive. In fact, the book says this: it says, the ultimate success of the flocks and the increase in his wealth came from God, not from stripped branches or anything else. Jacob trusted God, and that is what led to God's blessing. And so what we see the ultimate result here is now that Jacob has his own portion, and now Jacob has his own thing, God blesses Jacob. And he's no longer really blessing Laban. Now, he may still be, doing fine, but the blessings that really had increased Laban's holdings up to that point, God was no longer doing that, but rather God was blessing Jacob specifically. And because of that, Laban's flocks ceased to be as strong. He failed to get as much. See, excuse me. Laban thought Jacob was the golden goose. And so as long as he had Jacob, he was going to thrive. But the reality is that it was Jacob's trust and faith in God that allowed for the blessing, and Laban didn't have that. And so those blessings did not carry over to Laban once Jacob had his own flock. But we see in the midst of this, Jacob does all that he's supposed to do. He puts in the work, he puts in the time, he does what is necessary, but ultimately he realizes that God is the one that is going to take care of him, and God is the one that is going to bring the increase. And that's exactly what happens. This leads the book to ask this question: in what way should God's faithfulness to bless his people impact the thinking and lives of his people? And I would say the thinking and lives of you and I. So in what way should God's faithfulness to bless his people impact the thinking of you and I? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we're going to start closing out our study. When we think about this question, the important thing I think to think about is the idea that God's faithfulness means that he's not going anywhere. When it says God's faithfulness to bless his people, we need to understand that God is working for the benefit of his people all the time. And when we think that way, we begin to look at our successes and our failures a little bit differently. And when we look at our failures, we recognize that even in failure, even in when we have hindrances, even when we have trials, that God is at work in that, and he is still doing something, and that God is still bringing something good about it. And so the bad days and the bad nights and the trials and the struggles aren't as bad as they could be, because we have a hope that God's blessing and that God's faithfulness is going to see us through to the end. By contrast, when we see good things happen, when we see blessings, when we experience the favor of God, we recognize that it's God. And it leads us to worship that God has blessed us, and it's not the work of our own hand. And so it really does a great thing to us, where it allows us to be both humble and hopeful as we go through life. The book says this. It says, this was part of the promise that God made to Jacob when he saw the vision of the stairway at Bethel. Jacob's actions demonstrate his trust in God. Even though Jacob had been deceitful in the past, he acted with transparency in his agreement with Laban, and that he was relying on God to provide for him. This leads us to kind of close out with just a few statements that I want you to ponder, and then we'll close out our time in prayer. And it's this: it says, when we think about our life and what that means, the question is how much do we trust in God, and how much do we rely on God? And the book gives us these three statements to kind of help us gauge how well we rely on God. Number one, I see the blessing that comes from my work. So first off, ask yourself, when you are working, do you see the results of that? Do you see that as a blessing from God, or do you see that as something you have done, or that you worry about the outcome because it's all in your hands? Number two, I exhibit integrity in my business dealings. Are you willing to maybe even give up on easy money or all that stuff because you trust God and you rely on God, and so therefore you remain your integrity remains intact as you go through business dealings? Will you lie and cheat and do things in order to make as much money as you can? Or will you hold to your integrity and hold to what God has called you to do because you trust God to bless you ultimately? And number three, my work is an opportunity for others to see Christ working in me. Are you the type of person that is a Christian on Sunday, but when you leave the church on Sunday or Wednesday or whenever, that your faith gets hung up on a hook, and then you go live just like the rest of the world is? Or do you view every interaction, especially your business, especially the area of your life where you make money, as even that is an opportunity to communicate Christ's love and Christ's mercy and just Christ's characteristics to the world? Believers should act with integrity and can celebrate the way God blesses that honesty in their lives. I want to challenge you as we close up our time today. If you're writing things down or closing out in a little bit of discussion time, what are ways that you can demonstrate your reliance on God and your integrity as you go through your daily life? Whether you go to work, or you're a stay-at-home mom, or you're retired, whatever it might be, how might you communicate to other people example how you rely on God and how your integrity is connected to your trust in God in everyday life. Think about those things. I want to encourage you to close your time in prayer today and then join us for worship here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church at 11 o'clock. We are in person and we are also online through Facebook Live. We hope you will join us. Thank you again for joining us this morning. God bless.